Between 1978 and 1995, a campaign of bomb attacks sent by mail was carried out. His targets were mainly academics, scientists, and figures related to technology or modern industrialism. The explosions left a toll of 3 dead and 23 injured. The perpetrator spent years successfully hiding from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The difficulty of capturing him made American society feel terror. For 7 years, everyone was attentive to the UNABOMBER's next move. The criminal profile told the story of a very intelligent man, but alienated from society, with a hatred for all things technological. A person who probably lived alone and secluded by choice, but how to find him? This case was unique. The perpetrator was too meticulous in his task. He knew that the detectives were not making any progress, and he became confident. It was his own ego that ended up bringing him to justice. Who was he in a bomber, and why did he decide to become a monster? Theodore John Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, United States. Both his maternal and paternal family had emigrated from Poland, sharing some customs in the North American country, like going to church where his parents, Teresa and Theodore, met and quickly started a relationship. In 1939, the couple got married, and a few years later they welcomed Ted, who would be the second generation of the Kaczynskis born in the United States. Ted's childhood at first was quite normal. At 6 years old, he started attending Sherman Elementary School, where he studied until he was 9 years old, which would be 4th grade. By that time, Ted had become an older brother a couple of years ago to a boy named David, who was 7 years younger than him. With 2 children, the house they were living in had started to become quite small, so they ended up moving to the suburbs. Evergreen Park, where Ted was transferred to a school in the same place, called Evergreen Park Central Junior High School. Since he had started his studies, his teachers had noticed that Ted seemed to have an intelligence far above the average for his age. However, it was only in this new school that the suspicions were confirmed. With the parents' permission, of course, Ted was given an intelligence quotient test, which resulted in the boy having an intelligence quotient of 167 points. This explained why he found classes boring and was able to solve problems much more quickly than his classmates. After evaluating the possibilities, the school authorities decided that the best thing for him was to advance him. Several courses so that he would be in classes that posed a challenge for him and where he could learn instead of just being bored. After several other tests, they decided that his intelligence corresponded to what would be 7th grade, where they finally transferred him academically. In that course, Ted felt much more comfortable than before. He no longer got bored in class, and soon that made him one of the best students in the course. Even better than his classmates, who were quite a bit older than him in age. The real difficulty that Ted faced at that time was socializing with these older boys who had started to make fun of him, turning him into a victim of bullying. They played heavy pranks on him, they were violent both physically and verbally with him, and that generated an evident change in the personality of this boy, who became someone withdrawn, shy, and lonely. Since he started Evergreen Park Community High School, where he was part of the marching band playing the trombone. In addition to participating in other extracurricular clubs, such as the German language one, there he met other boys interested in science and math like him, although Ted was undoubtedly the one who stood out among his peers. During his 2nd year, he was put in an advanced math course, which he finished quite quickly. Just like what had happened in primary school, in high school he skipped the 11th grade, and at just 15 years old he was offered a special plan. With an intensive summer program, Ted managed to finish high school 2 years early. Still not yet 16 years old, his teachers encouraged him to apply to Harvard. Ted was accepted and entered this university in the fall of 1958, having already turned 16. Despite being considered one of the most promising new students of his generation, Ted did not seem to be prepared. He didn't even have a driver's license, for example. He wasn't old enough and didn't take the test. Those who knew him at that time described him as a very intelligent young man, but socially very reserved. At 20 years old, he graduated from Harvard with a degree in mathematics. An important highlight from his time there was his participation in the psychological project of the renowned Professor Henry Murray. They took a group of students, gave them code names to protect their identity. In Ted's case, it was lawful, and it was about studying his behavior in certain stress situations. To put it nicely, because in reality, many found the way it was carried out to be unethical. According to some sources, Ted participated a total of 200 hours in this project. Some people attribute his future actions, which we will see now, to this. This experiment has been much related to another, in a way similar and important. To better understand all of this, which for many is an important part of UNABOMBER's history, we need to talk about MKULTRA. The MKULTRA project was a secret program of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, which operated mainly between the 1950s and 1970s. With the aim of researching and developing techniques for mind control, interrogation, and behavior modification. The CIA feared that foreign powers such as the Soviet Union or China might be using similar methods to manipulate people and wanted to get ahead. To do this, MKUltra experimented with psychedelic drugs like lysergic acid diethylamide hypnosis, sensory deprivation, psychological and physical torture, and other extreme methods, often without the consent of the participants. For a long time, MKUltra was considered just a legend, a story, a sort of internet creepypasta with even riskier experiments. Finally, it was proven that the experiment was real and had serious consequences for the people involved. Because of this, many believe that it's possible Ted Kaczynski may have been a victim of this or a similar project. It is precisely believed that he was part of or suffered from this experiment during that project he participated in. However, this has been denied throughout his history. He even denied it himself. And he is a person quite open to talking. He is not someone who would keep quiet. Details about his life or how his mind worked or the processes that led him to commit the atrocities he did. On the other hand, the school project he participated in. These interviews were quite cruel. To start, the students had to write about a topic and present it. And in response, they basically had to disrespect them, tell them everything was wrong, embarrass them, and from there, observe their behavior. That was the basis of everything. So, there are also people who suggest that along with everything that happened to Kaczynski, this could have influenced his worldview. Anyway, again, he asserts that it's not like that it has nothing to do with it. And that he also began to think about technology and how it affected the world. From a very young age, he knew he wanted to distance himself from civilization and live more independently, which is something he did later on. After graduating from Harvard, Ted enrolled at the University of Michigan to pursue a master's and doctorate in mathematics. Specializing in the complex analysis of geometric function theory, a topic on which he wrote his doctoral thesis, titled Boundary Functions. This work was so brilliant that it allowed him to start making a name for himself in the scientific community. His professors were amazed at Ted's intelligence, especially considering how young he was. By age 25, he had already earned a PhD in mathematics. His academic resume was so good that despite his age, he was offered a job as a professor at the University of Berkeley in California. There he taught for a few years until without apparent reason. In 1969, he resigned to go back to live in Chicago with his parents. But he didn't stay there for too long either. In 1971, Ted's brother proposed to him to buy a piece of land together, half and half, to which he agreed, and went straight to Lincoln to analyze its possibilities. They bought a piece of land randomly for $2,100. That's where Ted distanced himself even further from society and began to live with less technology. On the land he had bought, he built a cabin where he had nothing. There was no heating, electricity, sanitation. There was nothing that made life easier. It was just a little house on land. There he learned anyway to cultivate the land, to make his own tools and his own clothes. Slowly, because of this, from being self-sustainable, he became a hermit. To begin with, he didn't like talking to people. They had treated him very badly. He was very shy, very closed off. And from that moment, he didn't feel the need to go outside and communicate with other people. Ted Kaczynski lived away from technology, lacking light when the sun set. The only thing he really used was his car and then a pickup truck. But by 1975, he no longer had a motorized vehicle, and if he needed to get somewhere, he simply asked for a ride. The first 10 years in his cabin, he had no significant relationships. He simply lived simply. Until he got to know the people who worked in places near him or in places like the local library. He also got along well with his neighbors, even if they were only occasional conversations without much substance. Ted didn't have the best relationship with others, but also, as you can imagine, he hadn't had anything romantic either. Or there had been very few of these experiences. As I told you, at that time he was living in Lincoln and had been hired by his brother at the company where he worked. There he met a woman with whom he had a short relationship, a few dates. He was excited, but she was not as much, so after a while she told him it was better not to continue dating. By then, Ted was over 30 years old, lived alone, had had several jobs, so one would think that he had to be mature, that he had to be an already established person. He was supposed to know how to handle his emotions, but he really didn't. The separation was so hard on his mind that he started leaving post-it type notes all over the office where they worked, in which he wrote poems about how ugly and bad that woman was. The harassment reached a point where his brother had to fire him. She, sometime later, would firmly deny having had any kind of romantic relationship with Kaczynski. I suppose they will understand that Ted was actually a rather violent person. The fact that he was withdrawn made this a little harder to see, but when no one was watching, he did unacceptable things. In his diary, he wrote more than once about killing people, and how to do it in a way that would leave no traces or clues, to avoid capture and continue killing. On one occasion, he entered a neighbor's house and broke their vehicles, as well as other technological items he found. All of this under the premise that technology is bad and leads civilized society to disaster. He was a volatile person, he was a violent person, and very difficult to understand. Over the next 9 years, Ted continued to have contact with his family, but increasingly occasionally. Until in 1978, nobody had heard anything about him for a long time. From a very young age, Ted formed a very firm opinion against the constant advances of technology. He was convinced that humans should return to the wild, and to convince society of this, he began a reign of terror, of bomb attacks that he sent through the mail. These were attacks that had such an impact that to this day they are used, and he is used as an example. In criminal profiling, his modus operandi, everything he did, has been used to learn about the behavior of this type of criminals, but he was exemplary. The first attack was at the end of May in 1978. It was a package that was sent by Buckley Crist, a materials engineering professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. The package arrived at his office as returned, as if the professor himself had tried to send it before and for some reason the address was wrong, or whatever, the mail service could not deliver it to its destination. Confused, the professor accepted the package. He did not remember sending any, so he carefully checked it, discovering that the address listed as his was not correct. With certain suspicions, the professor contacted the campus police, who in turn communicated with the police. But before they arrived, he decided to finish opening the package, which ended up exploding in his hands, causing injuries to his left hand. Upon being analyzed by the authorities, it was demonstrated that the device inside the package was, without a doubt, a homemade bomb, in which all the elements seemed to have been made by its creator, including the smallest parts of the mechanism, which made it extremely difficult to track down the responsible party. Because it's not like he had gone to buy the parts and then there was a record, whether it was a ticket, a testimony, a video, whatever. There was no way to find out. In addition, the person behind the explosive had been careful enough not to leave any kind of fingerprints on the package. So the police's job was very complicated. While the officers were looking for some kind of clue, a new explosive device was sent. And this time it wasn't a university, but it was sent to an airline. The 15th of November, 1979, a package arrived at the cargo of American Airlines flight number 444, which was going from Chicago to Washington, but the package did not have the expected success. Once the plane took off, the package unexpectedly began to smoke, filling the entire ship with smoke, so the pilot decided to make an emergency landing. Several of the passengers had to be treated for smoke inhalation, but none of these people were injured. The bomb's timer mechanism had failed, causing it not to detonate. Or was that what the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents said, even though no one was injured in this second attack? Attacking or targeting a plane in the United States is considered a federal crime, so the investigation is indeed. Although the Chicago police continued to assist, the investigation ultimately fell under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joining the investigation meant that there were more financial resources and better tools to find out who was the person behind the attacks, who they named at that time as the UNABOMBER because of the targets he usually had universities and airlines, although many also referred to him as the junkyard bomber due to the material he used to make the bombs, which was very common and ordinary. As if he had gone to a junkyard to gather little things, making a play on words with junkyard, which in English is known as scrap or garbage, with practically no clues to follow. The Federal Bureau of Investigation contacted one of the most important criminal profilers of the time, named John Douglas, who told them they were after an educated man with above average intelligence who also had a university education and probably adhered to the neo-Luddite philosophy, which is characterized by opposing the development and use of new technologies. Although Douglas's profile was extremely accurate, the investigators ignored him and decided to create their own profile. They agreed that they were looking for a man, but for them, they were looking for an airplane mechanic. This caused the investigation to not make much progress, and Ted was able to continue attacking without any problem. The next bomb package he sent was on June 10th, 1980. It was destined for an address in Lake Forest, where Percy A. Wood, the president of United Airlines, lived. The 60-year-old man was not fatally injured, but he did suffer significant burns and lacerations on his face, his hand, and even his left leg. As a result, he had to undergo several surgeries to remove the explosive fragments that had become embedded in his skin. Wood had not received any prior threats before the attack. The detectives were unable to find anyone in his environment who wanted to harm him. Therefore, given the lack of a clear motive, investigators concluded that it was another attack by Unabomber. As with the previous cases, the bomb package had been sent through the American postal system. Inside the package were several items such as a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of alcohol, and a book where the explosive was hidden. The way the device was assembled and the fact that the victim was none other than the director of an airline company. It was what convinced the detectives that it was the same subject that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was already looking for. The terrorist's fifth bomb arrived the following year, on Thursday, October 8, 1981, with when a bomber planted a new bomb, this time at the University of Utah. The security of airlines and universities was much more alert than before to the arrival of strange packages. And it was thanks to this that the campus police gave the order to evacuate the building before it exploded and could hurt someone. In approximately 2 years, a bomber continued attacking other educational institutions. For example, the 5th of May of 82, he sent one of his packages to Vanderbilt University, located in the city of Nashville. Unfortunately, they could not intercept the package before it exploded. Janet Smith, one of the administrative secretaries of the university, was the one who received this and who was injured. That same year, a few months later, a bomber attacked again, this time at the renowned University of Berkeley in California. On July 2nd of 82, an explosion was recorded in the engineering building of the university campus, specifically in the teacher's lounge on the 4th floor. The only one there was Professor Diogenes J. Angelakos, 62 years old, who was also the director of the electrical engineering program. Luckily, his injuries were not severe, but he did have to spend some time in the hospital to recover. After the explosion, the building was evacuated and inspected by local and campus police for approximately an hour before determining that there were no other explosives, and it was safe to reoccupy it. The terror was instilled. The feeling that anyone could be a victim of Unabomber at any time hovered over the university environments, as well as the airlines. After these two attacks in 1982, the terrorists took a break. For about 3 years, there were no new explosions, but that didn't mean they had stopped looking for him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the police continued to search for the person who had been behind the attacks, although they had not made any significant progress. 1985 was marked by 3 attacks, the first of which was carried out at the same university he had attacked years earlier in California. It happened on May 15th of that year, and it was the 8th bomb that Ted had sent. In this first attack, Ted seriously injured a 26-year-old graduate named John Husser, who worked in the labs, in addition to being a captain in the United States Air Force. The explosive had been delivered in a white plastic box, similar to where the materials from the suppliers arrived at the computer lab. Convinced that it was a safe package, he opened it and, due to the explosion, lost several fingers on his left hand, as well as much of his vision in his left eye. The second attack of that year was neutralized. People were becoming more and more alert, so calls to the police due to strange packages were happening more and more often. While most of those calls turned out to be false alarms, the one they received from the Auburn factory in Washington was real. Their administrative officials had quickly identified a suspicious package, and upon calling the police, it was confirmed to be a bomb. Fortunately, the authorities were able to neutralize it and prevent more people from getting hurt. Sadly, this was not the case in the third attack on November 15th of that year. On that occasion, the package was sent to the home of James McConnell, a psychology professor at the University of Michigan, and it injured both him and his research assistant Niklos Duino. That same year, a bomber claimed the first life in one of its attacks. It happened on December 11th when he sent a bomb to a computer store located in the city of Sacramento. His fatal victim was the store owner Hugh Scruton. This represented a change in the targets of his attacks. Suddenly, technology and computer stores were also added to the list of targets. When he attacked again on February 20th of 87, he did so by sending a package to another computer store, this time in Salt Lake. His attacks were news in all the press media. The authorities were more than alert to any possible indication. And for the first time in years, Ted Kaczynski felt he might be close to being caught, so he decided to take a break that lasted a total of 6 years. He struck again in June of 1993, detonating 2 bombs in less than 24 hours. The first one was on the 23rd of June in Tiburon, a city in California, where he sent a package to a university lab where a geneticist lost several fingers due to the bomb. Less than a day later, a second bomb exploded at the prestigious Yale University, injuring a computer science professor. After this double attack, Unabomber struck again a year later in 1994. This time it was a package that he sent to the home of a man named Thomas Moser, the executive of a marketing company who ended up dying from his injuries, becoming the second fatal victim of the terrorist. During the following year, the Unabomber's attacks continued without the detectives being able to find the culprit, which made Ted start to feel above the law. He was convinced that they would never discover his identity, and that led him to write to the Federal Bureau of Investigation to offer them a deal. If they could get the country's main newspapers to publish the manifesto he had written himself, would he stop carrying out attacks? The treaty in question was called Industrial Society and Its Future. It had a total of 30,000 words and was signed by Freedom Club, or in English, the Freedom Club. The main idea of the manuscript was that the Industrial Revolution had been a disaster for humanity, according to what was stated there. Technology had led modern society to a feeling of helplessness and alienation that ended up destroying all the natural instincts of the human being. As a solution, he proposed that society should rebel against technology and return to acting according to natural instincts. Kaczynski was so convinced that his manifesto was going to make people see reason, that he kept insisting on the deal he had offered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation that he was forced to take it. The Bureau agents began speaking with different media outlets to try and convince at least one to publish it. Finally, after much effort, they managed to get the Washington Post and the New York Times to publish the manifesto. Several publications were made with parts of the manifesto. But instead of having the result that Ted was expecting, it marked the beginning of his identification. Hundreds of thousands of people read the handwritten manifesto in the newspapers, among them David Kaczynski and his wife Linda Park, who, unlike everyone else, found ideas in the manifesto that they had heard before. Before contacting the authorities, the couple decided to confirm their suspicions, searching through old letters. Among them, they found some that used the same expressions as in the manifesto published in these newspapers, in addition to finding that the handwriting was extremely similar. The letters were from Ted Kaczynski, David's older brother, of whom they knew absolutely nothing since 1978. Still absolutely shocked, David and his wife contacted the police, who, just like them, at first glance, noticed the similarities between the manifesto and the letters. In an attempt to have confirmed evidence of this, they contacted a graphology specialist who was able to confirm that both the letters and the manifesto had been written by the same person. The Unabomber had a name for the first time in years. It was Ted Kaczynski. Meanwhile, authorities were trying to determine where this man was, who had cut all ties with society. Since 78, Ted had time for one last attack. On April 25th, 1995, when he sent a package to Sacramento that took the life of Gilbert B. Murray, a manager in the technology industry. It was his last victim, and the first time the news spoke of Ted Kaczynski as the culprit and not the Unabomber. The news was accompanied by the last photograph that had been obtained of him and the request that anyone with information should contact the authorities. It was not easy to find him, but after much effort, in April of 1996, the police managed to locate his cabin in Lincoln, Montana. Inside it, he had dozens of journals, a coded personal diary, explosive ingredients, and 2 already assembled bombs. In one of his diary entries, Ted said, "I do not pretend to be altruistic or act for the good, whatever that is, of the human race." He simply acted out of a desire for revenge. Upon being arrested on April 3rd of that year, Ted Kaczynski was subjected to various clinical examinations and psychological interviews to determine if he was unfit to stand trial. Several of the psychiatrists who treated him came to the conclusion that Ted suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The idea of being considered mentally ill outraged him. When his legal team tried to declare him unfit due to his diagnosis, Kaczynski tried to fire them and defend himself. But the court denied him this possibility, reinstating the lawyers. Desperate not to be seen as insane, Ted tried to take his own life in his cell, trying to hang himself with his underwear, but he was unsuccessful. Finally, on May 4th, with no other option but to accept his lawyer's strategy, Ted pleaded guilty to the bombings carried out between 78 and 96, in addition to accepting all the federal charges against him. However, the jury did not believe he was unimpeachable. They found him guilty of the charges and the judge sentenced him to 4 more life sentences. 30 years to be served in a maximum security prison in Colorado. The trial revealed that while the attacks were planned, the way he chose his victims was random, selecting them through telephone directories or university staff lists. According to him, he had no personal motives against them, but the goal of spreading a message. During the process, David's essential role in the arrest of his older brother was also revealed. Upon learning of this, Ted swore never to forgive his brother and began to ignore his letters. In the draft of a book he never published, he described his brother as Judas Iscariot, who doesn't even have the courage to go hang himself. Ted was imprisoned until June 10, 2023, when, at 81 years old, he was found unconscious in his cell by a guard. A few hours later, at 8 in the morning, he was officially declared dead. It was determined that the cause of his death was natural, as there seemed to be no other reason. Some sources claim to this day that Ted's mind underwent a change after participating in the CIA project, something he himself denied in several interviews, assuring that his participation there consisted only of talks with other colleagues. Whether it is true or not, the fact is that Ted Kaczynski was one of the most prolific terrorists in the United States. As I already told you, Ted Kaczynski was a withdrawn person, so he had no one around to talk to. He had no friends, he didn't see other people in his daily life, so he devoted himself to writing all his life, in journals. There are hundreds of pages that describe what happened to him and what he thought. One of the most notable moments occurs from his sexual frustrations. It's not news that some killers feel sexually frustrated, but in the case of UNABOMBER, something happens that we don't usually see. That is, from not being able to relate to women, he began to look for explanations. In his journey of self-discovery, he concluded that he was transgender. Currently, and due to all the years of psychological help he has had, we know that this was not actually the case. But he had a period in which he was convinced of this, so he decided to seek professional help and go see a psychiatrist. Sitting in the waiting room, he decided to get up and leave. He got angry with the situation, he felt frustrated and thought that what was happening to him was stupid. He was disgusted by what he had come to because of his frustrated sexual desires. All that anger was directed towards the psychiatrist and the world. He fantasized about killing her and described it in his diary. But he didn't stop there. All this helplessness he felt made him start over, as if he had awakened another part of himself. He was no longer afraid of death, much less the consequences of his actions. Lacking a moral compass, he realized he had no qualms about killing. That is to say, what happened in the 60s led him to become a serial killer, or at least it ended up defining him. The psychiatrist was not involved. It was simply the point at which he saw his frustration as something to drive his life and certain desires. And although we know Ted was very questionable, the manuscript he wrote left a mark on other people. Some of them took these ideas to the extreme, like its author. Among those inspired, we have Luigi Mangione, the man who in December of 2024 shot the chief executive officer of a large health company. In his confession, some similarities could be seen in his way of thinking about current society and the use or abuse of technology. The handling of ideas differs, but they share similarities at times. Regardless, the impression that the Unabomber left on society continues to this day. And well, this is where we end the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you already knew about the case before I made this video, actually I knew about it from some bits and pieces here and there, but not the case in detail. So tell me if you're in the same boat. Having reached the end of the video, here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means. And with nothing else to say, here is a new video, here is a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face and see you in another video. Goodbye.